So we know that according to Rawls, a political conception of justice is supposed to help us solve this problem of reasonable pluralism. What we're going to do now is look at how exactly it's going to do that. Because you might think at this point, well, that's all fine and good. We have a political conception of justice. Well, what does that mean for how we're supposed to behave? And how does that actually help us arrange society any better? Rawls's idea is that that political conception of justice limits the kinds of considerations that we can appeal to when we are acting as the public, when we are engaging in public or political deliberations, when we're passing policies, when we're voting, and so on. And these limits, these limitations, when people talk about them, they often talk about them under the guise of public reason, which was the title, I believe, is the title of the last chapter that we read from Political Liberalism. It's Rawls's discussion of public reason. And so public reason really kind of sets these limits. And as we're going to see, it's tied intimately to the political conception of justice. All right, so Rawls begins setting limits on, we've already seen some of these limits when we were looking at toleration. It's unreasonable to repress other reasonable comprehensive doctrines. We're going to get more specific now. And Rawls begins getting more specific by bringing in what he calls the liberal principle of legitimacy. And it's a principle that that identifies what kinds of political actions, which kinds of political coercion are justifiable, are legitimate, and which kinds of political coercion are not. And so what it says is that political coercion is justifiable only when it's exercised in accordance with the Constitution, the essentials of which all citizens may reasonably be expected to accept in light of principles acceptable to them as reasonable and rational. That's a mouthful. That's the way Rawls puts it. The idea is kind of simpler than that. Essentially, what he's getting at is that political coercion is justifiable only when it's exercised in accordance with a political conception of justice. And what that means is that it's justifiable political coercion, making people do things, right? Governments do that. They coerce people. They make you pay your taxes, for instance. And if you don't, they'll fine you. They'll make you pay more money. And if you don't pay that money, well, in the ultimate case, they throw you in jail. They come and take you from your home, put you in a car, and take you off to a jail, right? That's coercion. That's the nature of government in general. It coerces people. It makes people do things. And if you don't do them, it punishes you, right? You have to drive on the right-hand side of the road. You got to follow the speed limit. If you don't, you get punished. That's coercion. Political coercion, coercion from the government, is justifiable only when it's exercised in accordance with a political conception of justice. That is to say, a conception of justice that any reasonable person should be able to accept. A conception of justice that's derived from the overlapping consensus of reasonable comprehensive doctrines. So only when it's exercised in light of a conception of justice like that. Right? And so Rawls thinks his own theory of justice can serve as a political conception of justice. And so Rawls would want to say that political or governmental action that kind of follows from and accords with his two principles would be legitimate. So for instance, an example we talked about very briefly, progressive taxation. That seems to perhaps follow the difference principle. Installing a progressive tax would follow the liberal principle of legitimacy, inasmuch as that action is exercised in accordance with Rawls's theory of justice, which can serve as a political conception of justice in Rawls's view. Yeah, something like that. Related to this liberal principle of legitimacy is something he calls the duty of civility. The duty of civility is a duty that all civilians have, all citizens have, to be able to explain how the principles and policies that one advocates for, that one votes for on fundamental questions can be supported by public reason. The duty of civility is tied to this liberal principle of legitimacy, and so ultimately tied to this political conception of justice, but it's not entirely clear how it is. But we're going to see how it is by poking into this notion of public reason. But Rawls would want to say, if you are unable to explain how the policies that you're advocating for, that you're voting for, can be supported by public reason, you are violating this duty of civility, right? And you are acting in some sense illegitimately. Okay, so what exactly then is public reason? And we'll then return to this idea of a duty of civility. Well, Rawls describes public reason by describing the three ways in which it is public. And these are three different senses, right? So it's almost like three different senses of public reason, but they're all kind of contained in this notion, in this concept of public reason. So first, he wants to say public reason is public in the sense that it's the reason of the public. So when we get together as citizens to deliberate about what we're going to do as a society, we are using public reason. That's public reason. It's our reason, right? Our deliberations, our reasoning, when we reason together as a society, that's public reason. That's one sense in which public reason is public. Moreover, he wants to say the subject of public reason is the good of the public. That is to say, it's the fundamental nature of justice. And so public reason, really, we're engaging in public reason really only when we're considering these kind of fundamental the fundamental nature of justice, the fundamental structure of society and how things are distributed. So when we're, for instance, considering, I don't know, whether or not to plant flowers in the park or something, that's not going to really rise to the level of public reason. The kinds of strictures that he is imposing here, this duty of civility, this liberal principle of legitimacy, wouldn't be in play there because it doesn't really deal with the fundamental nature of justice. So good of the public. It's public reason. It's reasoning about the public, about the good of the public, about the fundamental nature of the justice. That's fundamental nature of justice. That's the second sense in which it's public. And the third sense is by far the most important. This is really what people are talking about when they talk about public reason. The nature and content of public reason is public. It is given by the ideals and principles expressed in the political conception of justice. And so what is public here means, right? The nature and content of public reason is supposed to be public. It's supposed to be such that any reasonable person can grasp it and agree with it. And so it's supposed to be derived from this political conception of justice, which is in turn derived from the overlapping consensus. This is really what he's getting at when he talks about public reason. Right? The nature and content is public in this sense, in the sense that it's derived from a political conception of justice. It's derived from this overlapping consensus. And so essentially what Rawls is saying is that when we engage in political or public deliberations, the only things that we should be appealing to are things within that overlapping consensus. We should not appeal to our own comprehensive doctrines, or put it this way, right? Because the overlapping consensus is part of every reasonable comprehensive doctrine. We should not be appealing to things that are specific to our own particular comprehensive doctrine. We should not be appealing to things that can't be found within that overlapping consensus. And so Christians, just to take an example, when they're engaging in public deliberations, when they're advocating for certain policies, the reasons for their advocating whatever policies they're advocating should not be drawn from their specific particular comprehensive doctrine. It should be drawn exclusively from the overlapping consensus. Because if you don't draw from the overlapping consensus, you are violating your duty of civility, because the policies you're advocating can't be supported by public reason, and you would be violating the liberal principle of legitimacy. You would be attempting to exert coercion in light of principles that not every reasonable person could accept, right? Think of it like this. Let's say you advocate for the pro-life position in the abortion debate, and you advocate it on the following grounds, right? You don't give an argument about the nature of personhood. You don't talk about or whatever things like that. You just cite. So you hear sometimes people say things like this. Certain Christians will just cite some passage from the Bible. I can't remember exactly the passage comes from, but it's something about how before you were formed in the womb, God had counted the hairs on your head, something like that. And that's supposed to show that God has this special concern for us from the moment of conception, even prior to our conception. But, it's something like that. Before you were even formed in the womb, but being formed in the womb, that's like you or something. And so something like that, right? So somebody might appeal to this scriptural passage. A Christian might appeal to this passage from scripture, say, this is what we hear sometimes in our society, to support a prohibition on abortion. Rawls is saying that would violate everything you see on the screen before you. Right? That wouldn't be an exercise of public reason. That would be a violation of the duty of civility and a violation of liberal principle of legitimacy. Why? Because your reason for advocating for, say, abortion restrictions in this particular case would be drawn from your own particular comprehensive doctrine and not from the overlapping consensus. Because the authority of your scriptures is not part of the overlapping consensus. Reasonable comprehensive doctrines disagree about that. They don't think your scriptures are divinely inspired. And so the policy that you're advocating, if your only reason for advocating is this passage from scripture, well, then you're not supporting it with public reason. You're not using reason, the nature and content of which is public. The nature and content of which is derived from a political conception of justice. And so you're attempting to coerce in light of principles that not all reasonable people accept. That's illegitimate. You're being uncivil, and you are violating the limitations of public reason. Now, that's not to say that any kind of advocacy of the pro-life side is illegitimate. That's all I'm saying is that particular kind of advocacy is illegitimate. Rawls would say if you want to advocate for the pro-life position, that's fine. You can do that, and you can attempt to coerce to use governmental pressure and forces to support your position. You can advocate for regulations on abortion, but your advocacy of those positions needs to be derived from the overlapping consensus, needs to be derived from a political conception of justice. You can't appeal to things specific to your own comprehensive doctrine. That's what he's saying here. That's the limit set by public reason. Last thing, Rawls would want to say all of this applies to voting. And so Rawls actually has what we might consider a somewhat counterintuitive idea concerning voting. We tend to think, maybe, I don't know, but we tend to think that voting is a private matter and that you can vote your conscience. And however your conscience decides, that's how you vote. And if you're conscious, right, something like that is what we tend to think. And that's your vote and it's private to you. Rawls is saying that's not really true. He's not saying that your vote should be made public or anything like that. No, it can still be private in the sense that you go into your booth and you don't need to share it with anybody or anything like that. But your vote is not private in the sense that you can appeal to your own private view of things. Because what are you doing in voting? You're attempting to coerce other people. I mean, that's the fact of the matter about voting. You're attempting to see certain policies put into place which are going to coerce people. And look, if you're going to do that, that coercion needs to be exercised in light of a political conception of justice, in light of public reason, right? That's what Rawls is saying. And so you can't just vote your conscience. Your vote should be derived from a political conception of justice, because your vote is your action, your public action. You are acting in the political sphere, and so it needs to be justified by principles that all reasonable people could accept. And that's going to be something like a political conception of justice, or principles of justice that can serve as a political conception of justice.